Hey everybody, this is Josh's Water Jobs vlog and podcast, and this is our first interview with a senior professional. Earlier we had a junior professional a couple weeks ago, and so now we're alternating. So, and with me today is Professor Aaron Wolf, who was one of my first mentors, and why I wanted to start with him on this podcast. So, Aaron, would you please mind introducing yourself?
No, happily. So I'm Aaron Wolf. I'm at Oregon State University, where I'm a professor of geography, and I run a program in water conflict management and transformation.
Great, thanks. So one question I'm going to ask all the people I'm talking with, and a very personal one, just to get a sense from people, is there a specific body of water that you identify with most, and could you tell us why it's meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think the Jordan is probably the one that comes up. I mean, I'm rooted to the area historically and religiously, and have spent a lot of time in that part of the world. And I think also, um, it's got wonderful history. Some quite famous people have lived along its banks, and it's been the site of some both real tensions and also first implicit and then explicit um, uh, ways of connecting across even very hostile borders. And so, for all those reasons, it's a very special water body.
Hmm, that's a good one. Um, so, what was your first water job?
Well, it's not one. I'm happy that I'm not doing it now. I work for a U.S. federal agency that, let's say, surveys geology, and I won't say which one necessarily, but it's a water agency, and it was very much on the technical side. I was a groundwater flow modeler at the time, really, really technical, looking at groundwater levels. And I was glad to be in it. I was glad to be in water, but I quickly realized that the technical world inside a windowless room, watching rivers flow across my screen digitally, was not my way that I wanted to connect with water and its people.
Okay. So and how did you get into water in the first place? How did that come about as the focus of your career?
Yeah. Well, way back in the early 1980s, I took my first, I think it was called a water science and policy class as an undergrad at San Francisco State. Nancy Wilkinson was a professor, and it just clicked. I mean, it's fun being introduced as a senior because it doesn't feel that long ago that I wasn't. But I mean, you do live long enough to realize that when these moments come, in retrospect, they're super, super clear. And as soon as I took that class and realized that this was this wonderful resource that brought people together, that brought people into dialogue, that helped people talk about really difficult politics, using a different, almost more neutral language. It just was one of those revelatory moments that I realized somehow that was the path for me. And initially, as I said, I thought the way to do it was through the technical world, and that's how I kind of positioned myself through my master's. And along the technical track, and then it was a little bit of reorienting to bring in the conflict resolution after that, and so eventually that combination of the technical and the human dimensions was really where I found my place in this world.
Hmm. So actually, yeah, it brings up to mind a few questions. So yeah, in terms of like our listeners and young professionals, what do you think about, getting a mastery or even a little bit on both the technical and the, say, non-technical sides of water? How valuable is that?
Well, for me, it's been critical. I could not have done what I do as a mediator, as a facilitator, without understanding both. I think there are a lot of good people who understand only the law or only economics or only the social aspects. And conversely, there are people who are really, really good hydrologists or biologists or geomorphologists. And to be in the place where we're really talking about water, my experience is you need both. You really need to understand physically what's going on to be able to understand where are the uncertainties in the model, where are the possible technical solutions that can be brought to bear. But you also have to know about people. How do people express themselves in a way that they open themselves to connecting at the values level, or being able to listen really, really deeply for places that they might connect. And so personally, I think everybody working in water ought to have some conflict resolution training. You can't manage water without managing conflict, full stop. And so even if it's only a course or two to understand that these are skills that can be brought to bear is useful. And again, conversely, I would urge anybody who's in law or economics or facilitation to know enough about the physical dimensions of a watershed to understand really where the variabilities are.
Excellent. So yeah, could you take us a little bit through your career trajectory? I mean, you said you started out with a U.S. government agency, and that was very technical, and now you're a professor at Oregon State. So what did that path look like?
Yeah. Well, as I said, since taking Nancy Wilkinson's class in the 80s, that kind of set me on the water as a way to deal with politics trajectory. And as I said, I assumed that if you only had the right technical solutions, that everything else would follow. So that was the initial path. And then it was working within as a technical person. And as I said, recognizing that the human side was as important for what I wanted to do, if not more important. So that led me back to school for the conflict resolution, the policy analysis. And even then, I didn't think that I wanted to be in academia. I thought I wanted to be, the water conflict resolver. And so even with a PhD, I started to apply for that kind of job, and it just didn't exist at that time. And so when I really looked around at the people who were doing it and doing it successfully, they were all rooted in universities. So it wasn't until a year after I finished my PhD that I really understood that I needed to be based in a university to be able to then be called into processes as a facilitator, as a mediator. And so that helped me first at the University of Alabama for 5 years, which was wonderful foray into a part of the country that I didn't know well. And then finally here to Oregon State, which has been my home for 23 years, and really being able to do that, to be based here, to be able to teach the students that are attracted to both the physical and the process side, and to be able, when there are processes, to be able to take the time and go get involved in basins all over the world.
Great. So you were one of my main mentors, during my career. And so who were your mentors? Who do you have a role model, and how did they influence your career?
Well, I have to say the field as a whole has been tremendously welcoming, and I hope that that's still true. I mean, there's no, nobody gets attracted to water for the wrong reasons. So I think in general, people who are in it, they're not getting rich, they're not getting famous, and so people who are attracted to water in general, my experience is they tend to be good, welcoming people. As I said, Nancy Wilkinson was the first water professor I had. She was great, and at the end of the class handed me a pamphlet on the University of Wisconsin's Master in Water Resource Management. So that set me off on the trajectory. And then the people who were kind of, really at the top and still are, were just wonderful and welcoming. And these are people like Asit Biswas, who's written, I don't know, hundreds of articles and books and has been the top of the field for 40 years. John Kolars was at Michigan State at the time. He was a Tigris Euphrates, since passed away. John Waterbury was at Princeton. He was a Nile guy, political scientist. He went on to become president of American University in Beirut. Jerry Deli Priscoli was running the conflict resolution program at the Corps of Engineers, and all of them. I mean, I approached Jerry out of the blue when he was deeply involved in Middle East water talks, and basically cornered him and said something like, "I want to do what you do. How do I do it?" And anybody else would have just said, "Yeah, see a kid," but it's just so welcoming. And well, here's what you do, and I can introduce you to some people, and send me the stuff that you're writing. And all of them were just into this world, just so welcoming and warm. And I think it's been that way. And I've kind of taken that to heart. People who are nice to grad students, I think, are genuinely nice people. So when I noticed that, I promised myself at the time that if I could then pass that on, that I owed it to them to be that helpful if anybody ever asked.
Yeah. And you definitely are, that's for sure.
Well, nice to hear.
Well, and coming to that, so I remember, one of the pieces of advice you gave me years ago, I don't know, over a decade ago, probably, was that, when I think I was upset that I couldn't apply for a job that I really, really wanted. And you'd be like, "Josh, there's always going to be another job out there." And so, which is, been the case. So,
Yeah.
So what's the best job advice that you ever received?
I mean, it sounds really trite, but to really kind of live by it, that things do happen for a reason. That even if it doesn't feel like it at the time, even apparent discouraging moments like you had, in retrospect, they'll make sense. The things that don't happen or that you don't get, the question that you can always be asking, even when discouraged, is what can I learn from this experience? And so that's the part I think that, and always to be. Always to follow an ethical path. I mean, it's just so easy to, once you start grasping for the next opportunity, I think in a very tangible sense, the idea that you accept the first, you stick to the first obligation that you commit to. Right. So I know there are sometimes temptations to, I accepted this, but oh my gosh, a better opportunity has come along. So to blow off the first one in favor of the second one, and just not to do that, it's better to lead your life ethically and morally and transparently, and that way that kind of grasping energy just doesn't ever take over, and it's not what's leading you, but rather just the goal of trying to do the right thing at the right time is a much more, I think, useful goal personally, but also, of course, for the world at large.
Yeah. So on the flip side of this question, have you ever received any bad job advice?
I probably have ignored it or forgotten it or lost it. I can't think of. So, no. I mean, there have been people who've tried to steer me towards, or advise that, more and bigger and higher, and that all those things are worth goals in and of themselves, rather than what I found is the kind of work-life balance and the just making sure that I'm following projects that I care deeply about and that I love. I think somebody once tried to urge me to rewrite an introduction to a grant so it played up the conflict dimensions of water because it gets attention, and that's not what I thought the evidence was showing. So those are the
Yeah.
kinds of things that turn out not to be very useful.
Yeah. Great. So did you ever have like really difficult moments when you're during your career development, a challenge, and how did you overcome it?
Oh, often. I mean, always. I mean, yesterday. uh, but part of challenges are, of course, external, but the other side of the equation is how do you accept it? How do you take it? And if you take it as a challenge, or you take it as something that's entirely negative, then it feels that much worse. So, as I say, I think anything that feels like an obstacle at the time is something worth learning. Is worth learning from. I mean, I think one of the harder things to um, just to deal with on a professional and personal level is in very tense negotiations when you're facilitating. Sometimes one of the strategies is to turn on the facilitator in a personal way, and so and that's tough. When somebody decides to accuse you of being, not just of being biased, but of having an ulterior motive, or of just being bad at your job, or whatever else, while you're in the middle of these processes and people are watching you and looking at you. Those moments are pretty tough. But
Yeah.
and of course, you don't get whatever, you don't get the grant, or you don't get the class, or you don't get or even teaching. Bad day of teaching can be really discouraging. You know when you're hitting it, and you know when you're not.
Mm.
And all of these, I think, are the normal vagaries of any kind of profession. But I think what I've been grateful for is my career is so diffuse and diverse. So if I teach a bad class, maybe I get the article accepted. If the article's rejected, maybe I have a wonderful conversation with somebody in the field, or if that doesn't work out, maybe I'm able to help somebody get to a next step. So there's always something that might be a little challenging, but there's always something that's moving forward as well.
Mm. Great. So what are you most proud of from your career?
Um, that's a really hard question to ask. I think it's not personal pride, but I think I was part of a group of people, of students and scholars and practitioners, who in the 1990s kind of collectively um, shifted a bit of what the dominant discourse was, from the assumption that water wars were both prevalent and inevitable, to starting to think also about the cooperative side of shared water resources. And again, this was a huge collective effort of a number of scholars and practitioners. And I think now there's so many people who not only think that way, but have taken it further. So the London School has now said, well, is cooperation entirely good, or is conflict entirely bad? And so much more nuance and so much more growth, and thinking about what treaties mean, and what dialogue means, and what power means, and hegemony. So I think in that particular pivotal moment, when a lot of security people really wanted to try and take us into a story about big hardware and inevitable warfare, that a group of people were able to help shift that just a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where I got on board too, around that
Yeah.
moment, so that was a little later. So, almost speaking to this, like at this point in your career, what are your hopes for the water community? What would you like to see
Mm.
this community accomplish?
I love where the water community is. I have to say, I mean, the fact that I can't keep up with the literature, with all the people working in it, and so many people are doing such exciting things. And what I think I really like a lot is so much of the social sciences have caught fire in this. I mean, this
Yeah.
really kind of morphed from a practitioner technical field into one that's much more holistic and much more nuanced. What I'm hopeful of, I think, in the dialogue around shared waters, I think we've not necessarily positioned indigenous communities and local communities with the voice that they rightly deserve, and I'm hopeful that increasingly we're able to do that. Think about um, the non-quantifiable values, the aspects of emotional water, spiritual water, water that's just tied to healthy communities for its own sake. Not,
Yep.
we talk about in environmental services, not in that sense, but just in as a venue for spiritual transformation in and of itself. And giving voice to that, I think, is a direction that I'm hopeful we become more attuned to, certainly in the international scale, and also at the local scale. I think we're pretty good about the dynamics of international water. There's a group of people, folks at World Resources Institute and IHE-Delft, have also been looking internally at
Yep.
dynamics within countries about how conflicts come about and how they might push trends towards poverty or towards migration, and how to alleviate that or prevent it from happening to begin with. Those are the kinds of directions that I'm hopeful we get better and better at. And I think again, there's a rich and robust enough community of people who are moving in that direction, and I'm hopeful that kind of the dominant discourse is able to accept these storylines and incorporate them.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So question a lot of us get it throughout our careers is, so where actually at this point in your career, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now? And also, like, how do you think about that question differently than you did, say, 20,
Oh
25 years
yeah.
ago?
Yeah, profoundly differently. I mean, it does really hit you that your time really is limited, and so how do you? It's 20, 25 years ago, I was thinking about broadening. I was thinking about how do I reach whatever the next big goal is, or the next big point that I want to make, or the next big project I want to accomplish. And now I'm starting to think about, how do I leave my world in wrapped up a little bit? How do I leave the papers so the next generation can pick them up? I've been running, well, like you've been running Josh's water jobs on a wing and a prayer. So I've been running a database on transboundary waters for 20 something years. Oregon State has been wonderful at supporting what it can, but it's always, with a little bit of masking tape here and a little bit of glue there. And so it's been going on 25 years. Well, at some point, once I retire, in around that time frame, we have to think about, okay, what happens to it? Where does it move on to? And we've benefited from folks asking that question. John Kolars and others have turned their retirement papers over to us, and so
Mhm.
it's thinking about that. How do you wrap things up? How do you pass things on? How do you make sure that the folks that are up and coming now are on good footing as I start to kind of step a little off to the side.
Yeah, yeah, great. Um, so, in this podcast series, we're talking to both young and senior professionals. And so what we're having them do is ask each other questions. So, we interviewed Antonella Vagliente, who's the Executive Director of Young Water Solutions, and she has a question for you, and then I'll ask you if you have a question for the next
Sure.
person that is interviewed. So her question was, so you deal with conflict, cooperation, and those types of issues around water issues. What advice do you have for a young professional who is actually growing up and raised in an area with conflict,
Hmm.
in a conflict area, who wants to go into the water space? Do you have anything specific for that type of person?
Oh gosh. Yeah. It's an unfortunate fact, I think, that people who do grow up in these settings often have real world tangible experience in what conflict can mean. It's not esoteric. It's not theoretical. And I think using that experience and that understanding to be able to motivate one to really help us move to a more peaceful, a more equitable, a more just water community, and by extension, a more just world. It can be powerful motivation when you know
Yeah,
the real actual cost of
cost.
conflict.
Yeah, yeah,
And so that's what I'm hopeful of. Had experienced a bit of that in my life, and just recognizing how bad we are at the global scale in dealing with conflict, um, and there's got to be better models. So I think that's what I would offer is use the experience to help us get to a better place.
Okay, great. And yeah, and what do you have a question for our next young professional?
Yeah, so I remember when I was starting, the biggest challenge was the internal dialogue between what my heart was saying was uh, uh, the actual path my heart was telling me I wanted to go on versus what my head was saying I needed to accomplish in terms of metrics and more tangible goals. And so I guess that would be the question is do you have this internal dialogue between your heart and your mind? And how do you reconcile it? What are the tools and approaches that you use to be able to either balance them or decide which one should be taking precedent at any given time?
Okay. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I know a lot of us have struggled with that over the years and even still do.
That's why I'm asking. I want to know the answer.
Great. Well, so that's it, Aaron. Thanks so much
Oh
for
my
all
gosh.
that insight. It was really incredible. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for this
Well,
interview.
likewise, Josh. What you're doing is so, so important. I mean, not the jobs is good, get everybody employed for sure, but the fact that you're doing this, always speaking on behalf of the next generation and the folks who are really taking control over this dialogue is really important work, and thanks to you.
Okay, no problem. All right. Thanks again. See you the next time.
Take care.
Bye bye. Bye bye.